In August of 1819, a wooden ship slipped quietly out of Nantucket harbor. Her name was the Essex, 20 years old, already worn by the sea. 21 men climbed aboard, chasing a fortune in whale oil. None of them knew they were sailing into one of the ocean's darkest stories. The voyage was expected to last nearly 3 years. Few aboard imagined they would not all return. This is the true account behind the whale that would inspire Moby Dick. Nantucket in 1819 was the whaling capital of the world. Its fleet had rebuilt itself after the ruin of the War of 1812. New hunting grounds had just been found deep in the Pacific. The Essex, though old and small, was considered a lucky ship. Her captain, George Pollard Jr., was only 29 on his first command. The crew trusted the vessel's reputation more than her condition. That trust would soon be tested far from any shore. Just 2 days after leaving Nantucket, disaster nearly struck early. A sudden squall knocked the Essex hard onto her side. Water poured across the deck as the crew fought to right her. 2 whaleboats were torn away and lost in the chaos. Captain Pollard considered turning back toward home. His first mate, Owen, urged him to continue the voyage. It was a decision that would echo through everything that followed. The sea had given its first warning, and it was ignored. Sailors on Nantucket believed a rough start meant a cursed voyage. Some of the crew grew quietly uneasy after the squall. Still, the Essex pressed on toward the distant Pacific grounds. Repairs were made at sea with whatever materials could be spared. The ship sailed onward, worn but still afloat. Ahead lay Cape Horn, and beyond it, an ocean few had charted. By January of 1820, the Essex reached the feared Cape Horn. Gale winds and mountainous waves battered the ship for 5 brutal weeks. The crew worked the rigging half frozen, soaked, and exhausted. Many sailors considered this passage the most dangerous in the world. Still, the Essex endured, inch by inch, wave by wave. On the far side waited calmer waters and the promise of whales. But calm seas would prove to be only a temporary mercy. Once past the Horn, the Essex turned north along South America. The crew began hunting along what whalers called the onshore grounds. Sperm whales surfaced in the distance, and the chase began. Small boats were lowered, harpoons readied, hearts pounding with adrenaline. Several whales were taken in the weeks that followed off Peru. The voyage, for a while, looked like it might be a success. No one aboard suspected what waited further out at sea. In October of 1820, the Essex reached the Galapagos Islands. The crew needed fresh water and food before pushing further out. Giant tortoises were gathered by the hundreds for meat and oil. The islands were empty, silent, and largely untouched by outsiders. For a brief moment, the crew rested on solid, unmoving ground. It would be nearly the last solid ground most of them would feel. Soon they would return to a sea that offered no such comfort. While anchored near Charles Island, an accident changed the mood aboard. A crewman started a fire as a careless joke, and it spread. Flames tore across the dry island, destroying its wildlife and vegetation. The men fled back to their boats as the island burned behind them. Captain Pollard was furious, but there was no time to dwell. The ship turned west, deeper into open, uncharted Pacific water. Ahead lay the grounds where the Essex would meet its end. By November of 1820, the Essex was far from any shore. The nearest land was over 1,000 miles away in any direction. This was water rarely crossed by ships of any nation. First mate Owen later called it almost untraversed ocean. Whales had been sighted in these waters just weeks before. The crew believed they were closing in on a profitable hunt. They had no way of knowing something far larger was watching. Life aboard settled into routine, but the isolation was total. No other ships, no radio, no way to call for help. Every man aboard depended entirely on the ship beneath his feet. The Essex, though old, had carried them this far without failure. Confidence had grown among the crew despite earlier warnings. On the morning of November 20th, the sea looked calm and ordinary. It was, in fact, the last ordinary morning the Essex would see. The morning began quietly, bright, and unusually still. Lookouts spotted whale spouts on the horizon shortly after sunrise. 3 small whaleboats were lowered to begin the chase. Owen remained aboard the Essex with a skeleton crew. The ship drifted gently as the hunting boats moved off. Nothing about the morning suggested anything was wrong. Then, from beneath the surface, something enormous began to rise. An 85-foot sperm whale surfaced roughly 100 yards off the bow. It floated motionless for a moment, as if simply observing the ship. Then it turned directly toward the Essex and began to swim. Chase later wrote he felt no immediate alarm at first. The whale's movement seemed unusually deliberate, unusually calm. Within seconds, calm turned into something no whaler had seen before. The whale struck the ship with the full force of its body. The impact shook the entire ship from bow to stern. Men below deck were thrown from their footing instantly. Owen and Chase rushed up to find the ship already taking water. The whale, dazed by the collision, floated briefly alongside the hull. For a moment, it seemed the worst might already be over. The crew began preparing pumps to clear water from below. Then the whale turned again, and this time it did not stop. Chase described the animal's second approach as full of rage. It came at twice its earlier speed, jaw snapping the surface. The whale rammed the bow directly, with tremendous, deliberate force. Timber cracked audibly across the deck as the hull gave way. Water surged into the ship far faster than any pump could clear. In minutes, it became clear the Essex was going to sink. No whale had ever been known to attack a ship this way. Within minutes, the Essex began rolling onto her side. The remaining crew scrambled to salvage anything they could carry. Navigational tools, hardtack, water casks, and a few muskets were saved. There was no time to gather enough supplies for everyone. The whaleboats that had been out hunting turned back in confusion. By the time they returned, their ship was already dying in the water. 20 men now stood on the open ocean with almost nothing. The captain's boat arrived to find the unthinkable had happened. Pollard reportedly asked Chase what on earth had occurred. Chase answered simply that they had been, in his words, stove by a whale. The Essex settled lower into the water, groaning as it went. There was no larger ship nearby, no signal, no rescue in sight. The nearest known land was thousands of miles away. Survival now depended entirely on 3 small open boats. With the Essex gone, the crew faced an impossible decision. The nearest islands, the Marquesas, were the closest safe option. But rumors of cannibalism on those islands frightened the officers deeply. Chase and another mate argued for sailing towards South America instead. Pollard, against his own instinct, agreed to the longer route. It would mean months at sea instead of weeks. It was a choice history would later judge with heavy irony. The 3 boats were fitted with makeshift sails torn from spare canvas. Rationing began almost immediately, since supplies were dangerously limited. Each man was allotted only a small measure of hardtack and water daily. The Pacific sun bore down without mercy hour after hour. Salt water soaked their food, worsening thirst across the crew. Days blurred into weeks as the boats pushed slowly eastward. The real ordeal of the Essex disaster was only beginning. By late December, the crew's condition had grown desperate. Lips cracked, skin blistered, and hunger gnawed constantly at the men. Storms scattered the boats at times, forcing frightening separations. Some nights, sharks circled beneath the fragile wooden hulls. Water rations shrank further as supplies dwindled with each passing day. Morale held only through sheer discipline and quiet endurance. Then, unexpectedly, a small island appeared on the horizon. The island was Henderson, a remote and largely barren outcrop. The crew found a freshwater spring, along with birds and crabs. For a few days, exhausted men finally ate something substantial. But the island's resources were far too limited to sustain 20 men. A hard decision followed. Most would continue on by boat. 3 men chose to remain behind rather than risk the open sea again. Their choice would ultimately save their lives, though no one knew it yet. The 3 men left behind faced isolation, not immediate danger. They built a small shelter near the island's only water source. Days turned into weeks with no ship in sight. They survived on shellfish, birds, and whatever the land offered. Loneliness pressed on them as heavily as hunger ever had. They had no way of knowing what was happening to their crewmates. Their wait would ultimately last more than 3 long months. Meanwhile, the 17 men who left continued east by boat. The ocean showed no mercy, and supplies kept shrinking. Thirst became more dangerous than hunger as fresh water ran out. Men grew weaker, their judgment clouding under the physical strain. The boats occasionally lost contact with one another in rough seas. Death, when it came, arrived quietly and without warning. What followed next remains one of the most difficult chapters in maritime history. By January of 1821, the first deaths occurred among the crew. Malnutrition and dehydration had taken a severe physical toll. Custom at sea in that era allowed the dead to be consumed. It was known among sailors as the grim custom of the sea. The surviving men, facing starvation, made the agonizing decision to continue. It was not something any of them had wanted or expected. Historical accounts describe the decision as one of desperate necessity. As January wore on, conditions aboard the boats worsened further. One boat vanished entirely and was never seen again. The remaining survivors grew weaker with each passing day at sea. By early February, food had run out completely once more. The men aboard Pollard's boat faced an impossible, harrowing choice. They agreed to draw lots to determine who would be sacrificed. It remains one of the most sobering, true stories in survival history. On February 1st, 1821, the crew of one boat drew lots. The unlucky name selected belonged to a young crew member. According to Chase's later written account, he accepted his fate calmly. The custom of the sea, brutal as it was, followed strict tradition. It was carried out by men who had run out of other options. Historians have studied this event as a case of extreme necessity. It remains one of the most difficult truths in the Essex story. News of the event would later shock readers around the world. Owen Chase's written account brought the ordeal into public record. He described the decision not with drama, but with quiet restraint. The survivors carried this experience silently for the rest of their lives. Few spoke of it openly once they returned home to Nantucket. The weight of those choices stayed with them for decades. Rescue, when it finally came, arrived almost too late. On February 18, 1821, a British ship spotted Chase's boat. The survivors were so weak they had to be lifted aboard. Days later, Pollard's boat was found in similarly desperate condition. Only 5 of the 17 men who left Henderson Island survived. Back on the island, the 3 remaining men still waited patiently. They were finally rescued in early April, after over 3 months alone. In total, 8 of the original 21 crew members survived. The survivors were nursed back to health aboard rescue vessels. Word of the disaster spread quickly through the whaling community. Owen Chase published his account of the sinking within a year. It described, in plain detail, the whale attack and its aftermath. Captain Pollard, remarkably, returned to sea after recovering his strength. Most of the survivors eventually resumed lives connected to the ocean. But the story of the Essex was far from finished. Decades later, a young sailor named Herman Melville heard the story. He met Pollard's family and read Chase's first-hand account closely. The tale of a whale destroying a ship fascinated him deeply. In 1851, Melville published his novel, Moby Dick. The fictional white whale drew directly from the real Essex disaster. What began as tragedy became one of literature's most famous stories. The true events, though, were far more harrowing than any novel. Today, the story of the Essex is remembered as a true survival account. It stands as one of the earliest recorded ship attacks by a whale. The choices made by its crew are still studied and debated. Nathaniel Philbrick's book later re-examined the disaster in vivid historical detail. The wreck itself was never recovered, lost somewhere in the deep Pacific. What remains is the written testimony of the men who lived through it. Their true story continues to remind us how small we are at sea.